All right, everyone. Well, we're going to go ahead and get started. As I mentioned before, my name is Glenn Engelberg. I am the Assistant Director of Recruitment here for the GEM program and for the webinar today. Thank you so much for joining us, and good morning or good afternoon where you are. And we are extremely excited to have everyone here today for this broadcast and webinar. And really the purpose of this webinar is to understand the current and future energy trends that will impact the energy field. And this spans regardless of what energy sector that you work in, whether it's utilities, oil and gas, renewables, so on and so forth. So to go ahead and discuss the most important energy trends and how the GEM program prepares students to face these challenges, we have our panelists here, Dr. Chris Hansen, and unfortunately, Dr. Michael Orlando had a last-minute conflict, so he won't be able to join us, but Dr. Christopher Hansen has plenty of experience and energy knowledge that he'll be able to share here today in a really unique perspective, as you'll hear momentarily with his current role as a legislator for the state of Colorado. So we'll go ahead and discuss energy trends. They've used their experience and knowledge to go ahead and formulate a conversation around this, and that's why it's entitled Energy Trends, a GEM Perspective. And we'll go ahead and discuss the GEM program's role in helping prepare energy leaders for this, along with the energy trends, future, past, and current as well, to get a better idea of how this all plays into everything. I'd like to quickly review some important information here on the GEM program, just to ensure that everyone has the same context of how everything here works together. So as you can see here, a couple quick facts about the GEM program. Some of you may know, some not. We are a 100% energy-focused master's degree. So we encompass oil and gas, renewables, utilities, all energy spectrums, which is very unique. And I think as you can see here too, we are an AACSB accredited business school, something that's only a top 5% designation that that master's programs have. But also we are a blended curriculum delivery, because our program really is designed for pretty much full-time working professionals, those that have busy lives. So we have the first 4 days of each quarter term on campus, so Friday through Monday. That way you can enjoy your vacation PTO days a little bit too. And then after that, we have the remainder of the program online in a more of a deadline-driven format that allows you to still continue to work while doing the program. We also have a strong partnership with the energy industry as well, where we're partnered with many government and business organizations across the energy spectrum to help keep things current. A couple quick facts here. We actually have been around for about 10 years and have our 20th cohort here starting in January, which we're very excited about, and over 400 students and alumni worldwide. Also, I think an interesting fact, as you can see, is that by the time they graduate, actually over half, in fact, 55% of GEM students have received a promotion since they've started the program. Which is great to see too for that ROI factor. And then lastly, before getting to our panelists here today, some of the courses, and actually Dr. Hansen will probably touch on this a little bit too. He teaches or leads the London and DC travel course that we have, which is a very exciting class, and also some other ones you see here from global energy issues, organizational behavior, accounting, what have you. They're all energy focused, which is really unique about our program. So even though they may sound something like classes you've seen before in other programs, what's unique is who's teaching it and what is being taught here with the 100% energy focus. And now, without further ado, as I mentioned before, unfortunately, Dr. Orlando had a scheduling conflict very last minute that he had to tend to, so he's not able to join us today. However, as I mentioned, Dr. Christopher Hansen has more than enough experience and knowledge to go ahead and help us here today. So I'm very excited to learn a little bit about his perspective on this. And as I mentioned, we have some prepared questions to guide the conversation today as well. So I will go ahead and ask them. We'll get some thoughts on it. Before we do, though, I want to mention a couple quick things. One is the audience. You may see a chat box at the bottom of your screen there. You can write a question there. We'll have some time, most likely, for a Q&A session at the end as well. And also, I'd like Dr. Christopher Hansen to briefly introduce himself here, and when you say a few words about your involvement with the GEM program, along with your current position, energy experience, and we'll take it from there.
Great. Thank you, Glenn. Thanks very much for that introduction, and welcome everyone to our webinar on global energy trends. Our purpose today is to give you a little bit of overview of some of the big things we see happening in the global energy industry, and to let you get a better understanding of how those fit into the curriculum at the GEM program and how we try to cover the entire energy spectrum. So we've got a number of questions that Glenn and I will start the discussion, and would love to have everybody chime in with any questions you might have as we go through the hour together. A quick introduction on my background. I wear several different hats, but one that I'm most proud of is I'm pleased to be the GEM interim faculty chair, serving that role since the retirement of the previous chair here about 6 months ago, and really helping to keep the program going while we recruit our next cohort. And calls like today are really part of that effort to reach out to prospective students and give you a sense of what the program's all about. Another part of my life is I serve in the Colorado Legislature. I represent the east part of Denver and work a lot in the legislature on budget and energy and environmental issues. And so it's been fun to kind of put my professional background to work in the legislature. Before I ran for office, I spent 10 years as an energy researcher and an energy economist at IHS Markit. Was in their energy analyst group, and then switched over to corporate M&A for my last 5 years when I was at IHS. So I've had a chance to work on projects all over the world and in many different sectors and locations. And I think that's one of the great things that we have across our faculty is a breadth of experience, both locally and domestic markets in the US, but also that global perspective. And it's one of the things I think that makes the GEM program really unique. As Glenn mentioned, I get the pleasure of teaching our 2 travel courses. So I handle our week-long excursion to the UK, where we spend several days in London and Oxford talking to top energy firms, top energy analysts in the European market. And we'll have a chance to talk a little bit more about that today. I also teach the DC travel course, where we spend 2 to 3 days in DC doing very similar meetings, talking to top government officials, top energy analysts, NGOs, nonprofits, and energy firms that are based out of DC. So that's one of the ways we put global into Global Energy Management Program. And that's one of my favorite things to do each year is to lead those courses. So Glenn, back to you, and we can start the discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. I like that line, putting the global into global energy management. I may have to steal that one from you, Chris. There. All right. So yeah, we'll get started with the questions here. The first one actually has to do with, I think, a transformation of energy from previous sources to newer ones. So Chris, can you comment on how you anticipate the growth of renewable energy in the next couple decades will potentially increase along with the decline of coal plants and productions, and just kind of that overall shift in the energy spectrum?
Yeah, I mean, Glenn, we really are in the middle of a very large shift, and it's happening at a pace that the utility industry has really never seen before. Just to give a little bit of context, the United States in 2010 had about 330 gigawatts of coal-fired power generation capacity. Since 2010, about a third of that has been retired or has been announced for retirement. So in the space of just 8 years, we've had this massive shift in how utilities are producing electricity and their expectations about their portfolios going forward. Now, that's happening for a bunch of different reasons. I think it's principally because of 2 economic factors. One is very cheap natural gas, and the expectation that we're going to have a lot of natural gas at low prices for a long time. And so that gives utilities confidence that they can switch away from coal and have a good backup alternative at a low price. The other thing that's happened is the extremely quick fall in prices for wind and solar. Solar is down about 85% over the last 10 years. Wind is down about 75% in cost. So the marginal cost of that electricity is now down with significant savings over what it was just 10 years ago. And that means that coal just simply can't compete. Coal is coming in, on existing plants at about 50 cents a megawatt hour. Wind and solar now are quoting at under $25 a megawatt hour. And it's not apples to oranges in that wind and solar is intermittent, but because of great system engineering, we've been able to handle that really everywhere where we've had lots of wind and solar come in. So it's really, to my mind, an economic argument that's pushing coal out of the production stack and leaves us with a mix of gas, wind, and solar as really the the new sources and of the portfolio growth over the next couple of decades to come. And I think we'll see coal steadily phased out, and it will happen pretty rapidly.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And I think even in one of your discussions too as well, Chris, on that topic, you were mentioning how literally coal plant production has literally almost ceased, right, as far as actually coal plants being built. I mean,
Yeah.
right? I mean, it's almost
No,
gone.
that's right. And my expectation is that we will not build any additional new coal plants in this country. It's really kind of just I think a story of how quickly will the existing fleet retire and be shut down. And some of those units are 50, 60 years old and are slated for retirement. And of course, as time goes on, that I think will accelerate. So yeah, I don't expect that we'll build any new coal plants. And in fact, if you look globally, the Chinese and the Indians, which have been the home of most of the new coal plants over the last 20 years, they are also pulling back very strongly on their original plans when it comes to new coal generation. India had about 1,500 gigawatts announced. That is now down to 400 gigawatts of announced and is likely to continue to fall. So that pipeline of new build, even in Asia, is already drying up. And the Chinese have had a similar experience.
No, absolutely. It just shows kind of the natural shift, especially as you mentioned with the decrease in prices and everything too as well. It just makes sense from the renewable side why that's shifting. Well, I guess along those notions too, this has to do with a little bit of the GEM program, and I guess just overall the importance of expanding your energy portfolio. I guess, can you comment on that a little bit, Chris, along, I guess, discussing the benefit of, for example, I know the GEM program, this curriculum teaches, oil and gas, renewables, utilities, the entire spectrum, and just really it's the overall importance of an energy professional this day and age understanding not just their specific field, but the entire spectrum, and just the advantage of having that diversification of their energy portfolio, for lack of
Glenn, that's a really great point. And, I mentioned before in my intro just about we try very hard to make sure that we have global coverage, and the travel courses are one of the ways that we do that. But the subsidiary point that you're making is also super important, which is, if you come out of an oil and gas background or utility background or renewables or whatever part of the energy industry you're in, you're going to get a chance to then explore in this program the other parts of the industry that you may not be as familiar with. And we think that really allows our graduates to go out and be utility players, if I may use the baseball term, across the entire energy spectrum. And you're prepared for leadership roles in oil and gas and utilities, renewables, et cetera, because you've now had a chance to experience all those other sectors in the classes that you're taking. So even if you come out of a certain background, you're going to get deep exposure to the other parts and start to see how they fit together. I mean, we touched on it a little bit, which is if you're in oil and gas, you're seeing growth in gas-fired power generation. And so suddenly your customer mix is changing. So as a gas upstream professional or as a midstream professional in oil and gas, you need to understand how your end customer demand is changing. The example from the utility industry is one. You could add fertilizer and chemicals and other big demand growth centers to that. And I think to be good at your job in one part of the energy industry, you really need to have understanding at a deeper level of the rest of the spectrum. And that's what we're trying to provide in this program.
No, I think that's great perspective there, Chris. Thank you. Well, on another talking point actually here, I know in your energy trends discussion, Chris, you talk about the unconventional revolution with key oil and gas plays. So I know we talked about coal a little bit, renewables. Can you expand on that further as far as, I guess, what you mean about the unconventional revolution with key oil and gas plays and just the importance of that overall?
Yeah, sure. And, especially for folks that don't come out of an oil and gas background, for those that do, this is going to be old hat. But, we've had this really amazing run of domestic oil and gas production in the U.S., and it's been enabled because of hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling. And we are now the number one producer in the world of crude oil, and we are the number one producer of natural gas in the world because of the combination of those technologies. And it has happened in a lot of different places across the U.S., or referred to as plays. So here in Colorado, we've got the Wattenberg play or the Niobrara play. You've got the Bakken up in North Dakota. You've got the Permian in West Texas. the Haynesville and Arkansas, right? So lots of different places. Have to mention the Marcellus in Pennsylvania, which has been the source of a huge amount of new gas production. Some of those plays are very wet. Some of those plays are very dry, meaning the wetter they are, the more liquids you're getting out of the ground. The drier they are, the more pure methane or natural gas that you're getting out of the ground. And that is really what has radically changed the global energy markets because everyone expected 10 to 15 years ago that the U.S. was on this kind of inexorable decline as far as oil and gas production. And we've completely turned that around because of the unconventional revolution and become very efficient at getting oil and gas out of the ground in a way that no one really anticipated before those technologies took off. To give you an example, in the Marcellus in Pennsylvania, we're getting natural gas out of the ground for $1.40, $1.50 per million BTU. In Colorado, we're getting oil out of the ground at about $30 to $35 per barrel, depending on where you are in the play. Some places a little higher, some places a little lower. The Permian in Texas, is in a similar ballpark, $30 or so. The Bakken, parts of it maybe just a touch higher. But, with market prices in the 60s, 70s range, companies are able to do really well with those kinds of marginal cost. And that low marginal cost is being driven by hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling. So it's that revolution that has really changed the world, and the U.S. is the epicenter of it.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's really interesting, especially as you mentioned with, I know with shale gas, and then, as mentioned, depending how wet or dry it is too with that. I know from basins in Pennsylvania, and I know like you were talking about as well too. So there's a lot of unexpected growth, and ones that are economical too, as you mentioned. So I guess kind of along those lines as well, Chris, I know you mentioned the energy landscape's always changing. I think we already talked about that from like coals, the shift with renewables, unexpected oil and gas plays. Are there any other changes that you expect the next couple of years, or maybe even a current change in energy right now that you think will have the biggest impact, at least in terms that the U.S. is concerned? And what do you think that might look like if it's something that isn't something you already touched on?
Well, I guess the other thing I would add to that list, we sort of talked about the macro trends as coal is in decline and other fuels and technologies are on the rise. And then, of course, the change in production on the oil and gas side. I think the thing I would add to it that affects every single part of the energy infrastructure is just the incredible amount of new technology that's being brought to bear. I mean, these are very high-tech industries. 50 years ago, oil and gas didn't really have that reputation. Now we've got some of the very best engineering and technology in any industry is in oil and gas. And utilities are experiencing something very similar. I think about like IoT, Internet of Things technology, where we've got remote sensing and a massive amount of big data that the industry is getting better at using every single day. And it's part of that story of pushing down marginal cost. It's part of the story of diminishing costs in the utility industry and being able to integrate wind and solar with smart grids and better grid management. All of those are being enabled by increases in IT technology to go along with some of the physical technology. So these things don't happen in isolation. And I guess that would be the other thing I would add to the list, and something that we try to cover, in a very thorough way during the GEM program.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And actually, I think that's an interesting point as well, is that analytics, I know just because of the conferences I go to, my involvement with the program as the Assistant Director of Recruitment, but that's become a huge field as well. I mean, you talk about the technology and all the money and everything that economically that's at play here. It's just really finding new ways to assess the data to make it as efficient as possible.
Yeah.
With that. So I think that's a really interesting one, definitely there as well. And yes, I know you mentioned earlier the GEM program, helping prepare students for this, because I know it's even on a random note, we've had what Chris touched on earlier, a lot of students that were in like utility side that went to oil and gas, or some even from the finance side that went to utilities and kind of cross industries, so to speak, but within the energy realm. So you just never know which one of these will pop up or what opportunities may be there, but just be prepared for all of them, right?
Yeah.
That's like that a lot of our students find beneficial with the program. So I'm going to have you put on your government hat here for a second, Chris. So since you are at the forefront of energy policy and legislator, I know you've been very involved on a few bills as well too. Can you talk about what changes you think in government policy that you anticipate having the biggest impact on the energy industry whether that be locally here in Colorado or maybe even nationwide, if there's something that stood out to you.
Yeah, no, it's a rich topic of discussion, and I certainly do a lot of this in my day job of as I'm working on legislation and the political side of it. But I think to make sense of it, we've got to start with economic analysis. We've got to start with strategic analysis. I guess what I'm seeing as far as trends is a very divergent path between what's happening at some of the state legislatures and governor's offices and what's happening in Washington, D.C. right now. So you've got the administration at the White House going in one direction. You've got a lot of states actually headed in the exact opposite direction. One example would probably be the Paris Climate Accord. We've got 20 different states that have basically signed up for the Paris targets, while the administration is saying we're going to pull out in 2021. So that's a pretty stark example of very divergent views on energy policy. The carbon debate, the climate change debate, and what we need to do about it will, I think, remain very active. But I think for the next few years, it's clear that the action is going to be at the state level. And of course, California has been very aggressive on that. And you've seen Washington State in the middle of a ballot initiative right now that would create a carbon price in their state. So lots of different approaches being tried out across the country, even though the federal government is moving in a different direction. In Colorado, I think the other thing that's really happening that a lot of folks on the call will probably be aware of is a very intense battle over setbacks for oil and gas production in the state. And Colorado has kind of become ground zero for these debates because we're one of the few states that have oil and gas resources right next to, in some cases adjacent to, suburban houses and development. It's a problem that doesn't occur very much in North Dakota, that doesn't occur very much in West Texas. But here in Colorado, we've got proximity that can lead to a lot of conflict. And we've got a ballot initiative in front of the voters right now that is looking to increase setbacks and would have a massive impact on oil and gas operations in the state. And in some cases, completely stop production in certain counties. So I think there's a very intense battle. We'll see what the voters decide. And then, of course, after the voters have their say in November, there'll be lots of additional work that's going to happen inside the legislature here and in other states. So some of those policy trends we certainly examine during our courses at GEM, understanding political risk, understanding policymaking, so important because you need to use that to complement your economic analysis when you're making decisions, right? These things don't happen in a vacuum. And we really tried our best to integrate policy thinking, political thinking, with all the economic decision-making tools that we teach throughout the courses. So you've got to have both. And I've certainly found that to be true in my career.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know, as I mentioned before, unfortunately, Dr. Orlando wasn't able to join us today, but he actually is involved with the political risk class that we have. And then it's interesting because with the dichotomy of that on the other side, then you have, Chris, which actually literally takes you to the forefront of it with the London and DC course, where you go ahead, and actually see it at the forefront in action. So, I think that's absolutely interesting. And especially the state versus national too, as well, it's something that's always going to be kind of like a battle, but yeah, there's definitely, it's kind of Colorado serving as a guinea pig, I guess, for lack of a better term, with a few of these different, amendments. In Prop 112, I think was the one you were specifically referring to. So, no, absolutely. Well, I know you touched on this a little before, Chris, but maybe kind of swinging back to it. Can you talk a little more about the U.S. as a natural gas leader? Because if I'm not mistaken, I believe we are a little more than Russia, if I'm not mistaken, as the #1 natural gas leader in the entire world as a country. And I was just curious as far as your input with I forgot, it's the Balkans or Permian in Pennsylvania, that base over there. I know it's a big player, and just kind of where you see the growth of that future in the next 5-10 years.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're on a continued growth path. There's going to be, there's just a very deep supply curve that we've developed in the United States. The Marcellus has many years in front of it. The Permian, the Bakken, Colorado basins. There is a very long and flat supply curve. And what I mean by that is that there's a lot of known reserves and there's a lot of known gas reserves at very low cost of production. So if you think about current U.S. utilization of gas, or how much we burn every year, we essentially have 50-year supply that is we already know where it is, we already know how to access it, and with current technology, we can access a 50-year supply probably for less than $4. So even as we go forward, that gives gas users a lot of comfort that the North American market is going to be low price and well supplied for a very long time. And that becomes a huge decision factor as you're thinking about, say, a new investment that uses natural gas. That gives you a lot of comfort that we're not going to have price spikes and long-term price escalation. It's not to say that an individual hurricane or a natural disaster or a pipeline problem or some short-term issue could crop up and cause prices to spike. But for the most part, we're in a situation where Henry Hub pricing, kind of the benchmark price in North America, is going to be very stable for a very long time. And that includes factoring in things like LNG exports. So even if we export a lot of gas, we've got so much available in reserves that it's unlikely to change domestic prices because of that flat supply curve. So it's a really good story for North American natural gas production.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it sounds like, economically speaking too, there's almost like a couple preventive measures almost so in place, where you mentioned to have that stability and that sustained stability over the next 30, 40, 50 years in terms of pricing, resources, supply. So I know that's why that's become more of a talking point too. And we're going to, as a reminder, I actually just got a great question here from one of the audience members about actually oil and gas. And Prop 112 specifically. We'll get into some of those Q&A questions at the very end here, but I just wanted to let you know, the audience, if there are any more other questions that pop up, please go ahead and write them in there, and we'll address as many as we can in a little bit at the end of our discussion today. So I guess so another topic too, Chris, that relates a little bit to this, just talking about other profound changes that will occur in the next 5 to 10 years domestically, besides the, let's say, sustained stability of natural gas domestically. Are there any other changes specifically within the U.S. that you would anticipate maybe surprise some of our audience, or like 10 years from now, something that just a way of life will be changed that maybe that we don't really think of right now?
Well, I think I would mention two trends that I think fit into that area. One would be I think the speed and the breadth of the change in the transport market. So I think, electric vehicles, electric light duty vehicles, trucks and SUVs, and even long haul trucking are going to see some very rapid penetration of EV technology. And so, I think you can make the case that the US probably has reached peak oil consumption, meaning we'll probably never burn more oil than we did in 2007 and 2008. We've kind of had this steady decline. One reason for that is energy efficiency on the vehicle side. Our internal combustion engines, our cars and trucks are more efficient than they were just a few years ago. And then I think you add hybridization and EVs to that, and I think we're really at the kind of hockey stick moment, if you think about the graph in your head, where it kind of takes off. And I think we're really right on the edge of that, where we're going to see rapid penetration of EVs. That is going to fundamentally change the global energy market and the oil markets. I think you're going to see Western OECD countries continue to reduce the amount of oil that they use, even though the overall global market will grow for a while longer because of China and Asia. The OECD, I think, is going to kind of lead the way in turning that curve back around. And so that also fits the other big trend on the electricity side, which is this disconnect between GDP growth and energy use. If you think back to the 60s, 70s, 80s, there was always this very tight correlation between GDP growth and more oil consumption, more gas consumption, more electricity consumption. In the 70s, for every 1% of new GDP, we used about 2 to 3% more electricity, right? So the economy was growing and electricity use was growing even faster. And similar things had happened in the fossil fuel side. Now those correlations are much weaker. For every 1% growth in GDP right now, we're adding about 0.25 or 25 basis points to new electricity consumption. And essentially around the country, most areas are just flat. There's no new load growth, even as the economy is growing. So we're more efficient, we're using our energy more wisely, and those are going to have huge impacts on the global markets. And I think EVs, better technology on the electricity side, smart grids, right? All of these things are combining to cause massive shifts in the energy industry. And I think to be effective as a leader in an energy firm, it's so vital to understand these big trends and then how they, impact your decision making. And that's what we're trying to do a great job of in the GEM program of giving students those tools.
Yeah, absolutely. And I definitely want to talk about how you incorporate some of those trends and themes in the DC and London course. I think it's a fascinating thing. And we actually just had some perspective for the audience. We had students that just came back from this a couple weeks ago. I know it's a jam-packed trip. Chris, knows firsthand, of course, about it. There's a lot that they do, so I definitely want to get into that. But before that, too, just something I thought of is that I know a little while back, when the energy trend talks, as an example, you talked about, I think, how California or Arizona wanted to initiate a policy that all roofs now had to have some solar capability, if I'm not mistaken. Is there any kind of trends like that you see in a different state that you could go ahead and see coming to Colorado, or just, let's say, a trend like that in California that will spread to other states in the next few years that we may see? Yeah,
California has done a bunch of interesting things. I think Hawaii, Washington, Oregon are other examples. But it's played out in other states too, particularly in the Northeast of the United States. One trend that I see is this steady march to 100% clean energy. There's a lot of different ways to define that. Some people say, our goal is 100% renewables in the electricity sector. California has said, well, we're going to give ourselves some more flexibility. Instead, they've used the phrase 100% clean energy. And so that allows them to use hydro imports. And in some states, nuclear may be a part of that mix. We've got pumped hydro stations in some states. So it really will take different flavors in different places. But I think that is an overall trend. And in fact, it's been under heavy discussion here in Colorado is what kind of renewable energy targets do we want to set? What kind of clean energy targets do we want to set for the state? It's interesting to me because there's a lot of places that have what are referred to as renewable portfolio standards, RPSs. Colorado has a 30% RPS, but our main utility, Excel, is on the way to 55%. And so these RPSs, which used to drive investment and be kind of the target that everybody had to hit and invest to make sure that we got there, now companies are making investment decisions that are just straight economics. Because of those low costs that I mentioned earlier. And these policy prescriptions, where it was a minimum bar for what percent you needed to get, have not really factored into many companies' decision making. So I think one trend is, what is the next version of the RPS? What is the next policy that is going to perhaps drive investment decisions? Or do we need anything at all? Do we just let the market do its job, and that government policy should just be focused on enabling that market function? And those are the debates that we're going to have in Colorado. Those are the debates that we're going to have across the rest of the country. But I think as far as trends go, I am seeing now a steady march of more aggressive targets, higher percent requirements. And I think that will continue and will be active in Colorado as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it makes sense too with the increase in technology and efficiency that you would only see those targets get more aggressive, right? So I can definitely see the correlation between the two. Well, actually, one last question, or kind of, two-part question here I want to talk about is just the DC and London course. And then we'll go into a couple, just for the audience, a couple quick upcoming dates here for the GEM program, and then the Q&A session here in a moment. But I guess, Chris, can you talk to us a little bit about that? Why don't we start with the DC portion of your travel course first with, I guess, what trends specifically or main themes do you try to incorporate into that trip to give students a unique perspective as far as how everything works together?
Yeah. I think for the travel courses, and this is true for DC and for London, and and the UK trip is that we're trying our best to cover, again, the entire spectrum. So we're going to hear from nuclear advocates. We're going to hear from clean coal researchers. We're going to hear from natural gas associations, utility groups, solar energy, wind, et cetera. We're going to do our best to cover the entire spectrum. And, the trends that I'm seeing there, I think are, looking carefully at the latest news and then trying to make sure that that's reflected in the meetings that we have when we get there. So, for example, in the UK this year, the hottest topic in the energy field is what is Brexit going to mean for those firms? They are a highly interconnected energy economy with the EU, and will Brexit disrupt that in some way? They trade power back and forth across the English Channel. They get oil and gas from pipelines from the continent. They are wanting to ship products from their refineries to other European ports, right? There's all these ways that they're interconnected, and that became a big theme of our course, was to take, rip it from the headlines. Here's what's going on, and how does this affect corporate strategy? The other great meeting that I think that helps illustrate this is we met with the Shell Scenarios team. Some of you may be familiar with the Shell Scenarios project. They put out fresh thinking on the energy future all the time, and we met with their team and we talked a lot about carbon pricing and what that's going to do to the oil and gas business. You actually have now, a large group of the super majors who are pushing for a carbon tax, a carbon price. Shell, BP, Exxon now all part of that effort. So it was great to hear directly from Shell and BP when we were in London about, okay, here's how we think a carbon price works, how it should work. Here's what it will mean for our business. Here's how we think we can be really successful in that environment and continue to grow the company and return shareholder value. And they make the point, which is a correct one, which is we're going to need hydrocarbons for the foreseeable future. The intensity of usage, the patterns of usage will change, but we're still going to need hydrocarbons. And, they feel like they can do a better job than anybody at delivering those to market. So that's their basic corporate strategy. But to hear from the horse's mouth, so to speak, hey, here's why we support a carbon price, which is a somewhat surprising thing to hear from a giant oil and gas firm. And then to see how that affects their corporate strategy, I think that's a pretty invaluable thing for our students. And that's what we try to do with these travel courses, is talk to, the people on the front lines. At the front edge of the blade, so to speak. And I think both in DC and London, we're able to do that.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Chris. Yeah, thank you so much. I think that, just really going ahead and I think, as you mentioned, it's one thing to read about and see it, but then to go ahead and hear from, the VP of Shell, or to hear someone that's actually a decision maker like that really puts into a new perspective, especially when it's locally there with it. And there's so much interdependence too, especially like in somewhere like London or DC that has key cogs in so many places domestically as well as internationally.
Right.
So yeah, thank you so much for that. So, well, right now here, I'd like to go ahead and just shift gears just a little bit here with the audience, where we will go ahead and briefly talk about just a couple key dates that are coming up here that I want everyone to see tomorrow. I know some of you who are here listening right now will be here either via webinar or in person. If you are able to come in person, it will be on 15th and Lawrence, where our business school is. We'll have a speaker series with the U.S. Energy Institute, featuring the U.S. Chamber of Commerce VP discussing the Energy Security Index and energy risk. And in a few weeks, if you aren't sick of my voice yet, I will actually have a GEM admissions webinar. That will be specifically focused on the actual curriculum of the program, in depth about the student experience, what you can expect, as far as working full-time, time commitment, all those kind of things. And I plan on having a GEM alumni as well that will kind of speak from the student's perspective too, to be part of that. Also, I did want to mention here that we have our application deadline for cohort 20 coming up here in a couple months. I'm not going to go into all the application detail stuff yet, but as a reminder, it usually takes about 2 to 3 weeks. So there's definitely still enough time for those that are interested in that class. And of course, you can reach out to me directly for that. And then our 20th cohort will begin here on January 11th. And we already have a great class here that is being built for that, and excited to add a few more as well in the next couple months. And I want to thank Chris again for going ahead and participating today. I know we greatly appreciate it. And before we get to the Q&A session right over here as well, that we'll have, I just want everyone to have my contact information in case you don't already. there is my email as well as phone number. Please feel free to reach out to me directly if you have any questions on the program or want a recording of this. We will be happy to go ahead and do that as well. All right, so now I know we have a couple questions here that I will go ahead and have here for Chris. So I want to make sure we are able to get to that. So we will go ahead and start with the first question here right now. The first one actually, and this actually has to do with Prop 112 as well too. Chris, feel comfortable answering what you do, because I know it's sensitive, considering your position. But in your opinion, here's a question. Would it be wise to cut off these oil and gas resources using Prop 112? And then on a comment on that, the attendee asked, wouldn't we need the tax revenue from these oil and gas resources to assist in achieving the 100% RE or renewable energy goal by 2030 for Denver, and otherwise converting to that? So I think it discussed the transition and how, and just overall, if you think that would be wise to cut off those resources.
Yeah, a couple good questions there. I think, we've got a situation where, 112 is essentially a blanket policy for the whole state, right? It's 2,500 feet. It doesn't matter where you are on state or private land. It wouldn't apply to federal, but it would apply to state and private land. I have been clear whenever asked that I'm not in agreement with Prop 112. I don't support it. I didn't vote for it. I think it's too much of a one size fits all, and it would effectively eliminate oil and gas production in many parts of the state. And I have been on record supporting enhanced setbacks in certain situations. I've been on record of trying to better address orphan wells and pooling and a large number of things where I think we need to make progress as a state. But I think Prop 112 just goes too far and is too much of a blanket policy. So for instance, could we move forward with a policy that would increase setbacks from schools to say 1,500 feet? Let's look at that. We have examined it last year. We couldn't get it passed through the legislature, and we need to keep working on that. But to me, that seems like a better approach than doing a single policy for the whole state, and a policy that would effectively take giant chunks of land out of production. The other thing that I've told people that sometimes surprises audiences is that if you're really worried about climate change, you also have to think about the impact of stopping local production on climate change, because the state is still going to demand oil and gas. Right? There's going to be a while before electric cars, take a big chunk of the market. It's going to be a while before our homes stop needing natural gas to be warm at night. And so if we have to bring in oil and gas from distant domestic sources or foreign sources, the emissions footprint on that is going to be much higher than if we use local. So I think that's an interesting angle that a lot of people don't consider. Now, the other part of your question about tax revenue, also fascinating. The oil and gas industry does pay a huge amount of tax in the state every year. It's close to $1 billion when you add it all up. And that goes for schools and roads and lots of things from the local government through the state government that money is used for. So that would have a huge impact on the budget if we were to go in a direction that reduced tax revenues. Now, the other thing to keep in mind, which I think was embedded in the question, is that money needed for the transition? And I think the answer is no. Those funding sources don't have anything to do with renewable energy or electric vehicles. Those are tax revenue is mostly used for schools and roads and a few other wildlife programs, et cetera, as well as policing the industry or regulating the industry. So there's not really a correlation between oil and gas taxes in Colorado and energy transition to clean energy. The nice news is that we don't need subsidies for clean energy anymore. Those days are basically over. The federal subsidies are winding down over the next couple of years, and they are low cost enough on their own that we don't need to cross subsidize. So I guess just in your mind, separate those two ideas. Oil and gas revenues, big important part of the budget, and if something were to reduce those, it would cause us to have to really rethink the state budget. But separate that from the energy transition piece, because they don't really cross over in Colorado.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting. And essentially, without getting too much to a political debate about it as well, of course, everyone like myself has an opinion on it. I think the big thing to take from that is one, that it is much more of an extreme, all-encompassing ban, including, for example, dry creek beds that have a 2,500-foot setback, when there's something, for example, as schools, which is much more common sense and would not have nearly the economical impact in terms of continuing growth of the industry as well. So it's just too extreme. I think as you mentioned, it's too all-encompassing, for that. And also as well, too, it sounds like as we transition, potentially to more renewable energy sources as well, it's not a black and white transition, Chris. I think you'd agree with that as well, that there's a lot of things that we'd have to go ahead to set in place before, even outside the tax revenue, to make sure that certain entities were sustainable by themselves, but still having, let's say, oil and gas or natural gas resources to go ahead and help build them and get them in that place, right? Any transition like that would take a very, very long time. It can't just go like a snap of a finger.
Yeah, it's not a snap of a finger. I mean, I will say, though, I think it'd be quicker than a lot of people anticipate. I'm reminded in this situation of a very famous photo of Fifth Avenue in New York. And there was one that was taken in 1902, and then they took the exact same spot 13 years later. In the first photo, there were 0 cars. In the second photo, there were 0 horses. So we made the transition from horses to cars, not because we ran out of horses, but because cars were better and cheaper and faster and less manure. And I think we're going to make a very similar transition to EVs as those prices fall. They're cleaner, cheaper, faster. They have less maintenance. The cost of ownership is going to be lower than if you have an internal combustion engine, and it basically is there now. If you look at the latest models, from different manufacturers. And so I think we're at as I said, that hockey stick moment in that transition. So it's not overnight, but it can happen very, very quickly relative to how things normally go in the energy industry.
Yeah, and of course, too, there's a lot more oil and gas, even just outside cars. But I think that's definitely a shift that next 20, 30 years will be, if they take a picture of, let's say, 10 years ago versus in 2035, will look vastly different.
Right.
Public transit vehicles or just domestic cars for use.
Yeah.
Actually, on the note a little bit too, another question here is that kind of relating to energy versus MBA, we have a question, Chris, I'd love your opinion on it, that if, let's say if a prospective student or if I, in this position was debating between an MBA and let's say the GEM program, why do you believe the GEM program would be a better fit for an energy professional if they plan at least on staying within the energy industry?
Yeah, and I think it's that last phrase that's the key. I mean, this is a 100% energy-focused program, and if your goal is to move into management and leadership within energy, then I think the GEM program offers a better alternative to a more generalist MBA. And there are lots of people for whom the generalist MBA is the right fit. They want kind of more of that flexibility and fungibility in their career. But I think if you really want to stay in energy and all of its different forms, the GEM program gives you a better toolkit. And I think, Glenn, you've seen it play out in people getting promotions. You've seen it play out in people being able to pivot in their careers from maybe a non-energy field to an energy field after the GEM program. That's really what we're offering here. It is a targeted, focused program. You will leave with the skills you need to be successful across the energy industry. The MBA is a great degree, but it just doesn't have the same amount of focus that we're trying to bring to the GEM offering. So that to me is the fork in the road for a prospective student to think through, what does my next ideal job look like? Where do I want to be in 5 to 10 years? And adding these tools that I'll get out of GEM, does it help me get there? And for some people, they may come to the conclusion that, no, I want the MBA. But I think if you're really focused on energy, this is a tremendous option.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Chris. I think so. That's interesting too, is that if you actually go ahead and I have sat in on several classes, about 80 to 90% of the students are energy professionals across all different spectrums too. So I think that's just an interesting demographic in terms of learning from your peers, sometimes just as much in certain cases as your instructors, who are all energy focused as well. So so a couple of the questions we have are a little more individual specific, and I will get to those personally. As a quick reminder, with anyone, if you have any questions or want to reach out to me, I will send an email to everyone who attended here with the recording that we will have along with a quick follow-up. And as I mentioned, we are still working with students for our upcoming 20th cohort here in January and have that speaker series tomorrow. So feel free to email me with any questions on that, which we will broadcast via webinar, but you can also come in person, enjoy a little bit of a lunch. We'll have a few GEM alumni there as well, which I know is really helpful for some people to connect with and find out that perspective. So I want to thank you again so much, Chris, for joining us here today, as well as the audience as well, too. I hope that everyone found this very, kind of thoughtful and now has a little more of a different perspective on some of the energy trends that we're seeing now, why we are, and a few things to look at in the future, and how the GEM program can go ahead and help, maneuver all that as well. So thank you again for everyone so much for coming, and I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your morning or afternoon, depending on where you're watching from, and have a great day.
Thanks.
Thank you.